From Battleborn Progress, this is Out in Front. I'm Jacob Solis. This week, we bring you part 2 of our series of interviews on Project 2025, the blueprint for a second Trump administration. If you joined us last episode, we sat down with experts on labor, education, and environmental policy to drill into how the authors of Project 2025 want to weaponize or dismantle huge swaths of the federal government. If you want to go back and catch up on that episode, you can find the link on our YouTube and Facebook pages. But this week, we talked to 2 more experts to examine what risks Project 2025 could pose to abortion rights, as well as LGBTQ plus rights. Finally, you may have heard that the Democratic National Convention is underway in Chicago right this second. So we wanted to take a policy-centered look at one of the big decisions being formalized there. And that is the nomination of Minnesota Governor Tim Walz as the vice presidential nominee. Walz made his name in Minnesota, backing a string of progressive victories in the last couple of years. But to understand why any of that matters to Nevadans and the country, we turn to a Minnesotan to learn more. With that, let's get to the rest of the show. Last week, we heard a lot about some of the ways Project 2025 would gut federal agencies as a means to enacting these long-standing conservative policy goals. But this week, we wanted to zoom into some of the ways that the authors of Project 2025 would weaponize the federal government in ways that would do real harm to real people all across the country. That is maybe no clearer than in the section on abortion, where Project 2025 has proposed bans or limits on most abortions nationwide through a series of very specific federal policy proposals. And to dig into the specifics, joining us now is Alexa Solis. She's a deputy director of Planned Parenthood Votes Nevada. Alexa, thanks so much for joining Out in Front.
Thank you so much for having me.
Well, I guess we should get into it. And I think what we should do is start from maybe the 5,000-foot view. And maybe that requires a little bit of context. So a couple weeks ago, we saw some reporting when Trump basically tried to disavow Project 2025. His campaign manager said, we don't even know these people, which is all very funny because Project 2025 was written by Trump administration alums. They were all there. They all know each other. And even then, right, a lot of the points made in Project 2025 that we're going to get to in a minute, stuff like banning the mailing of abortion pills or increasing surveillance of people who are seeking medical care related to abortions, right? All of this stuff is stuff that we've seen come up in federal cases in federal court from judges appointed by Trump. So we'll start here and we'll start broad. What gives?
Well, I think to your point, this does require a lot of level setting and maybe even a little bit of looking back at former President Trump's first presidency. Ultimately, what we know is that he is responsible for the overturning of Roe v. Wade, which was step 1 in this plan. The abortion policies laid out in Project 2025 are possible only because Trump laid the first building block, by appointing a Supreme Court that overturned Roe v. Wade, even when they said they weren't going to. So now when we're thinking about Project 2025 in the context of the upcoming election and what that might mean should Trump win re-election, it's really important to understand that this was just the beginning of this long plan to go further than just overturning the right to abortion. And like with policies limiting IVF, limiting access to birth control, and as you mentioned, even further limiting access to abortion in states with protections like Nevada. So ultimately, that's what I would say. This is just a symptom of a much longer plan. And we certainly don't want to see that happen here in Nevada.
Absolutely. And I guess to this point of when we talk about, okay, in Nevada, right, abortion has been protected for a long time because of ballot measures and what have you, and we're going to have another one this year, right? Important stuff in state. But looking at the national picture, it is a threat because of the kinds of things they can do and even some of the things they contemplate in Project 2025. And I guess to talk about a specific proposal, one of the things, for instance, is enforcing this thing called the Comstock Act, right? Which is this old, 150-year-old anti-obscenity law that prevents the mailing of abortion-related materials through the mail. And what Project 2025 wants is to say, okay, well, that includes stuff like mifepristone, right? The pills that would be able to induce abortions. And there was just a big Supreme Court case about this. And frankly, that Supreme Court case did not settle this question of whether or not you could mail these pills. So it would theoretically be possible for the Trump administration to just roll this back. So I guess to put it in another way, it is not necessarily a theoretical question to say there could be really big federal overarching restrictions on abortion if Trump wins?
Yes. So the overturning of Roe v. Wade it really unleashed a whole new kind of policymaking, including something like enforcing the Comstock Act, which if we could just like take a minute to think about what happened in Arizona when legislators there, or when the Supreme Court there said that they could enforce a Civil War era abortion restriction. People were extremely upset, and people from all parties said that they did not want that, and they did not want that in their state. And that's so true of this as well. These are deeply unpopular policies, and they are deeply threatening to the American way of life, the freedoms that Nevadans enjoy, and people's ability to make their own reproductive health care decisions. And that's just a really important like level setting and context setting when it comes to this. And could you repeat the last part of the question there?
Yeah, absolutely. I guess, and you know what I'll do is I'll ask another question, because all of this, I think, we can see a microcosm of last year, or rather this year, I should say. So much happens in a year. There was a Supreme Court case related to mifepristone, right? The abortion pill, which, by the way, safe and effective and has been approved by the FDA for over 2 decades. But Project 2025 basically echoes what that federal judge in Texas, Matthew Kacsmaryk, argued, which is that the FDA should never have approved that drug in the first place, and we should get rid of it. Well, basically now what Project 2025 proposes is the FDA should just get rid of it on its own. And so I guess my question is, or rather, to what degree is there any certainty that these federal agencies can't be sort of captured by the conservative movement that did this deeply unpopular thing, get rid of Roe v. Wade, and essentially use the weapons of the federal government to do exactly that, to do these unpopular policies and to restrict abortion nationwide? How real is that threat?
It's deeply real. I think it's no question to anyone that when they say they're going to do something, they'll do it, no matter how unpopular it is with Americans, even their own voter bases. So I think it really poses a very real threat to people everywhere. It's going to further compound the issues in states that already have abortion bans in place. It will now expose states like Nevada that previously maybe have thought that the abortion protections that they had in place could insulate them from these things. And it certainly might, but we're going to be thrust into an entirely new legal complexities that we've never had to face before. And that's why we're doing and pursuing things like the constitutional amendment in Nevada. We are working really hard to make clear that this is absolutely not something that's acceptable to us here. It's not something that Nevadans are willing to allow to happen in our state. And I think that that's true across the country. So what I would really like to underline is how deeply unpopular these policies are, and that will not stop them from pursuing them if they are to win power.
Absolutely. Well, I think to the point of these policies being deeply unpopular, I think it's probably worth digging into some of the other, frankly, wild things that Project 2025 wants, that they put out in writing in these, 400-page documents. And this one gets me because it's frankly Orwellian. I feel like an overused word. Everything's Orwellian. It's 1984 all the time. But this one, frankly, they want to roll back sections of HIPAA, right? The Health Insurance Portability and Accountability Act. For everyone taking notes at home, the word privacy is not what the P stands for, but it's fine. However, right, everyone knows HIPAA protects your private medical information. And essentially what Project 2025 wants to do is make it so that health insurance providers, right, hospitals, doctors, nurses, whoever, right now, they don't have to divulge whether or not someone is getting abortion-related care. And in the world that Project 2025 wants, actually, no, they would love if doctors, nurses, and hospitals had to divulge that information, maybe to police in a state where such care might be illegal, right? They are contemplating a world in which there can be a prosecution for what ought to be, and what I think lots of folks, to the point you're making, believe should be a personal medical decision, right, between one person and their doctor. So, woof. I mean, what are we to make of a proposal like that?
It's almost hard to fully convey what the proposal of a policy like that means to me, both as an abortion rights advocate and also as a woman in this country alive at this time. I think ultimately it highlights how extreme a lot of these policies are, and how deep they're going into the regulatory space, which is somewhere that politicians, I mean, ultimately, like, what we're talking about here is making sure that patients are getting the care that they need, the care that is safe and tested and available in the modern day. And we simply cannot allow policies like this that would take us back centuries. In fact, it's even an entirely new kind of world. It wouldn't even be going back, because this level of surveillance wouldn't have been possible in any other time. So it's truly dystopian, I guess is the word I'm looking for. And I think really people should be aware and know that this, if for whatever reason you are waffling on the decision on who to vote for or anything like that, I would really take this stuff into account, because we know that no matter how hard the Trump campaign or other Republicans who align themselves with these kinds of policies try to distance themselves from this Project 2025 proposal, we have to know and understand that they will make good on this promise, and they will go this far. They've already shown us that they would do it. They did it with Roe, and they will do it again. So I think ultimately that's what we're talking about here.
Yeah. As they say, when someone tells you who they are, believe them. Well, I think we're going to have to leave it there. Alexis Solis, you're the Deputy Director of Planned Parenthood Votes Nevada. Thanks so much for taking the time to be on Out in Front.
Thank you for having me.
And finally, we wanted to take a look at what Project 2025 has to say about LGBTQ plus issues. Anyone who's read the project, quote unquote, will notice there is a religiosity element that runs throughout, often with a focus on the biblical family. Alongside that, Project 2025 has laid out a vision in which most or all of the gains that LGBTQ activists have made in the last 2 decades are rolled back, envisioning a world that rolls the clock all the way back to, look, frankly, it's a while. So here to dig into some of the details and really why some of the specifics of what they're proposing matter is the State Director for Silver State Equality, Andre Wade. Andre, thanks so much for taking the time for being on Out in Front.
Yeah, my pleasure.
Absolutely, absolutely. So this is it's almost difficult to to condense all of what Project 2025 wants to strip back when we talk about LGBTQ rights, because it's so sweeping. So looking through it, what were the parts that stood out to you as sort of particularly egregious?
Yeah, it's all egregious in that it's an attempt to totally erase LGBTQ plus people from existence at the federal level. And that's quite alarming because, to your point, they're trying to roll back things to maybe the 1960s, even if before. Erase all the gains of the past couple of decades to have this recognition throughout policies at the local, state, and federal level. And what that really means is that there would cease to exist any mention of sexual orientation, gender identity, and expression. Even the data collection around these things that we refer to as SOGI, SOGI, sometimes E for expression, which is really important because we need data to be able to find out what's happening with our community to better implement interventions and have funding to address these issues around healthcare, child welfare, criminal justice. And so if we remove that, then we will have no work towards a healthy population of people who have historically been minimized and removed from the existence of the federal government and other institutions. And it's also alarming that there's a specific target towards transgender people, referring to transgender people as transgenderism, and that there being a sort of agenda, and that transgender people should be removed from public society, really. And that would equate to not having any protections around gender affirming care for adults and young people. And so, broadly speaking, it's maddening. It's what they have always wanted to do. Now they've made it public, essentially. So we now know their game plan.
Yeah, saying the quiet part out loud, as it were. So I think to dig into some of this stuff, because I think certainly when we talk about this issue and the way that like the federal government interacts with LGBTQ rights, obviously there's stuff like marriage equality comes to mind, certainly protecting gender affirming care. But there's some more arcane stuff, right? There's the nitty gritty of the federal government matters a lot to protecting all kinds of rights. And one thing I wanted to zoom in on was Title VII. So this is noodly, but it banned sex discrimination in the workplace, right? And so this was it was a recent Supreme Court case, and frankly, the conservatives behind Project 2025 do not like that essentially LGBTQ identities are included in sex-based discrimination. So you can bring a civil case under Title VII. And I guess operating under the principle that Project 2025 wants to get rid of that new principle, what are the ramifications of something like that? What protections do people lose when something like that goes away?
So with the Bostock ruling a few years ago, we were really able to try to, through legal measures, solve for what the Equality Act tries to do, and to have a blanket sort of protections for LGBTQ plus folks around sexual orientation and gender identity. And the Biden administration has put out guidance to say that whenever sex is referenced in these protections, it's to include sexual orientation and gender identity. And so there are these broader protections that we have when it comes to employment and other aspects of life. And really what Project 2025 and the Heritage Foundation and their cronies want to do is just really have that be more of a narrow interpretation of the ruling to just mean protections around hiring and firing, and not these other protections one would need while on the job and facing potential discrimination because of one's sexual orientation and gender identity. And the project would even want it to not be a thing to where LGBTQ plus people would have any sort of protections. So it's like if you try to file a lawsuit, they'd be like, yeah, just kidding, because any sort of protections around workplace discrimination, as an example, that's outside of hiring or firing someone, won't exist. And that's beyond alarming. That's ridiculous.
Right. And this is, I mean, for like egregious workplace issues, right? That any other person, right, any other protected class would have protections, but Project 2025 says LGBTQ people can't count. Yeah. So I guess, oh, yeah.
Can't count, won't count, never counted in their eyes. And so this is just one thing that they're trying to do, but it's getting at every facet of our lives. And so it's something that we have to address wholeheartedly.
Absolutely. And I guess to that point, something I wanted to ask was, we've seen in other parts of Project 2025 that the Heritage Foundation, like you mentioned, envisions a sort of more active role for certain parts of the federal government in ways, say for abortion, for instance, we talked about earlier in the show about using the CDC to surveil pregnant women, or using or getting rid of parts of HIPAA to make it easier to find out if someone is getting an abortion where it might not be legal. In this instance, is there any concern that or I guess let me phrase it this way. What is the concern that Project 2025 or something like it could weaponize the federal government against LGBTQ people? I mean, we've seen this historically in the United States. And so I guess what are the risks there?
The risks are that the basic protections that we have been fighting for that gives us equality, aiming towards equity. They refer to LGBTQ plus equity, which I think is interesting when we talk about the definition of these terms, that there would be no LGBTQ plus equity. That idea, that approach, that philosophy would cease to exist. So that's a full stop. So you might as well figure that that means that any protections that we think that we thought we had just won't be there. And so if you think about the SOGI data collection, and we talked about earlier, you can say that, well, what's the harm in the data not being collected? Well, that means that we would cease to exist. There would be no telling of how many people are accessing services and who's being discriminated against to even address some of these issues. And particularly around transgender folks, they won't allow people to serve in the military anymore. And that in and of itself is just something that we have worked hard towards, having LGBTQ plus and transgender equality and equity be embedded into the federal government and, again, in our everyday lives. And so I can't even put into words how harmful it would be, but we would just have to think about what life was like for queer people in the late 1970s, early 1980s, when we were in our communities protecting our own by creating our own nonprofits, creating our own systems of protection and caring for each other, especially during the AIDS crisis. We would have to go back to those measures, and we would not have any federal funding from the federal government and even pass-through dollars to even do some of this at the nonprofit and community level. So even trying to do this work through a nonprofit, through federal funding, or even anything close to it would cease to exist. And that means that a large portion of nonprofit life would cease to exist because we would have fewer funding from that bucket of giving.
Yeah, I guess I get many of our younger listeners or viewers, I suppose, maybe they don't really remember a time when it was a lot worse than it is now for LGBTQ folks in this country. But you don't have to go that far back, right? Even just to the 1980s or the 1990s, when the federal government, either through malicious intent or malicious neglect, right, made things a whole lot worse for a lot of people. So tough stuff. And I really appreciate you taking the time. Andre Wade, Silver State Equality, thanks so much.
Thank you.
To close out today's show, you may have noticed that this week is the Democratic National Convention. To mark the occasion, we wanted to dig into one of the big names you may know but may not know much about, and that is Vice Presidential nominee and Minnesota Governor Tim Walz. He's made his name in recent years for a string of progressive policy wins in the land of 10,000 lakes. But what should we in Nevada take away from any of that? To figure all of it out, we've brought in an expert. Emma Poyer is the communications director for the Alliance for a Better Minnesota. Emma, thanks so much for joining Out in Front.
Hi, thank you so much for having me.
Well, thanks for being here. And I guess, you know what, let's start broad, because we've seen the Tim Walz on the campaign trail. We've seen Coach, we've seen the camo hats. But policy-wise, right, I guess, or even just the guy, what should Nevadans know about Tim Walz?
For sure. Well, I'll start off by saying that there is a lot of excitement in Minnesota about Tim Walz rising to the presidential ticket, and in large part because it's been a really exciting few years in Minnesota under the leadership of Governor Walz and our Democratic progressive trifecta that came to power during the 2022 midterms. So since we've had that kind of trifecta Democratic power, and under the leadership of Governor Tim Walz, Minnesota has seen an entire slate of really transformative policy. And what is exciting to us is seeing someone like Governor Walz, who's been such a champion for things like abortion rights, climate policy, gun reform, infrastructure, education, fearlessly and also so proactively now step into a bigger limelight. And with the potential to, create change on a bigger scale. So there's been a lot of progressive policy wins in the last few years that we've seen kind of shepherded by Governor Walz. And some of the kind of the top lines of those include codifying abortion rights as one of the first things that he signed into law following that Democratic power transition. In addition to universal school meals, which is really transformative legislation offering free breakfast and lunch to every Minnesota student across the state, as well as some massive investments in public education that are implemented right now and that students are already seeing the effects of across Minnesota.
Well, there's a lot to dig into, and I want to actually drill into something you just mentioned there, because what I want to do to really set the stage for folks in Nevada is to do a point-by-point comparison, because the governor, Joe Lombardo here, Republican, he set a record number of vetoes in the 2023 legislative session, including vetoing some major legislation that has, if not direct parallels, extremely close parallels in the state of Minnesota. So one of those things, you just said, free school lunches. So what does that program look like in Minnesota?
Yeah, for sure. First of all, I don't know why anyone would oppose offering students free meals at school. We know that students learn, better when they are fed, are more engaged in the classroom. And so this legislation seems like a no-brainer to us here in Minnesota, and it's wildly popular across the state. Essentially, as of this past fall, every Minnesota student will have access to free breakfast and lunch at school, no matter your zip code, no matter your income range. And that's just kind of included in the school experience, funded by a variety of programs created by Democrats and Governor Tim Walz in 2022. And the effects of that have been really positive. Families are happy, students are happy, teachers are happy, school lunch workers are happy. There's no turning away students because they can't afford their meal in the lunch line. And all in all, these are the kind of policies that really support working families.
Absolutely. And I guess in Nevada, one of the things that came up, and certainly what the governor tried to justify his decision to veto that bill here, was essentially that, it shouldn't be universal, right? It should be means tested, right? Only the poorest students should have access to free or reduced lunch. What is the benefit to the universality of something like free school lunch?
For sure. We don't know the situation that students are coming from. We don't know the family situations. And so having a universal school lunch or school meals program is just essential in terms of equity and making sure everyone has access to the same basic fundamental resources. We're not talking about extravagant state paid resources. These are meals. This is breakfast and lunch for students that students can be fed at school. And having a universal school program, that's not means oriented, but it's just kind of across the board, is really ensuring that every student is fed and that schools are a place where students can rely on having a meal. You never know where your next meal is. You never have to be worried about where your next meal is coming from, because we are creating that reliable system within our public education department.
Absolutely, absolutely. So the next thing I wanted to ask about was gun policy, especially gun violence prevention policy. So for context in Nevada, right, I think maybe there's some parallels here where we do have a sort of robust rural population that enjoys hunting, or obviously it's a big part of the American culture. And certainly that's part of the Minnesota culture as well. So, but in Nevada, in 2023, Governor Joe Lombardo vetoed 3 gun violence prevention bills, including raising the age to buy certain semi-automatic firearms to 21, banning people who are convicted of hate crimes from buying guns, and another bill that would have closed the ghost gun loophole, right? The guns without serial numbers. So in Minnesota, as I understand it, there's been sort of an interesting evolution for Tim Walz specifically, but I guess generally speaking on these sort of gun violence prevention bills. What would you say is the takeaway in your view?
Yeah, for sure. I think it's interesting. I think Minnesota is similar to Nevada, and where we have a lot of people who are gun owners, who are engaged in hunting, who are engaged in gun ownership as part of recreation, and really want to ensure that they, can continue to have those rights in responsible ways. And that's something that Governor Tim Walz has also advocated for. I know on like a personal level, he is a gun owner, he is a hunter. That's something that's important to him. But what is important here, and what is important about the policies that we've passed in Minnesota, is that Minnesotans believe you can be a responsible gun owner, and that doesn't mean we don't have restrictions on who can own guns and how we own guns. And in the last few years, we've passed a series of legislation that supports responsible gun ownership. So increasing red flag laws, increasing the restrictions on background checks, just ensuring that guns are going to be in responsible hands, and that we are actively working to decrease gun violence in our communities. An issue that, we're seeing increasingly so across the country, and is increasingly becoming an issue for Minnesota families. No one is interested in the tragedy of gun violence. And so we can, have responsible gun ownership. Individuals, families can own guns, but how are we doing that in a way we are managing the potential risk, and also making sure we are protecting young people and people in our communities? And that's what this kind of the legislation of the last few years in Minnesota, championed by Governor Walz, has really set to do.
Absolutely. So finally, the last thing I wanted to touch on were climate issues. So in Nevada, under the previous Democratic governor, Steve Sisolak, there was a Nevada climate strategy. Essentially, it wasn't perfect, but one of the big takeaways was that it was trying to get the state to net zero greenhouse gas emissions by 2050. Mm-hmm. Under Governor Joe Lombardo, the state's climate strategy is more nebulous. There are fewer well-defined goals, if any, other than a quote-unquote balanced approach to energy, which one takes to mean more fossil fuels. So in Minnesota, what has been the overarching climate strategy? And I guess in what ways have we seen the state government try and tackle climate change as an issue?
Mm-hmm. Yeah, so for sure, the biggest advancement in terms of climate policy in the last few years, again, signed by Governor Walz into law in 2022, was a commitment to being 100% carbon free by 2040. And, this is similar, I think, to the legislation you were mentioning earlier. And what this does is it decreases our reliance wholly on fossil fuels, and also invests in, sustainable, long-term, environmentally conscious infrastructure to ensure that we are able to not just meet that goal, but to continue to invest in our green economy, in our green jobs, and are paving the way for future generations and Minnesotans to grow and thrive. And I think this legislation is incredibly important, and we are seeing similar initiatives across the country, and it really paves the way for this kind of responsible investment in the state we want to be in.
Yeah, I mean, you mentioned investment. Obviously, everyone loves when we talk about investments, but this is really, as much as it is a climate policy, it's an economic policy, right? In order to build out the infrastructure for green energy, that is, we're talking about jobs, we're talking about infrastructure, we're talking about a lot of stuff, right?
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm, for sure. Yeah, it's not just a climate policy. Labor needs to be involved in these decision making. Like how are we building out the green economy? How are we investing in solar? How are we moving away from carbon electricity and fossil fuels in a way that is going to not just make sense and be effective for our economy, but is also going to be something we can rely on in 20 years, in 30 years, in 40 years, in an ongoing and sustainable way.
Okay, well, finally, I want to give you a chance to just plug Minnesota, because what a big moment for the state of Minnesota to be on a national ticket like this. Mm-hmm. So I guess for you guys over there, I know you mentioned it a little bit earlier, but I mean, like, what do you take away from this moment? And especially that, I mean, just having this conversation, progressive policies are essentially at the center of this pick. So what does it mean that some of these progressive policies are now on the national stage?
For sure. It feels really meaningful. The last few years under Democratic leadership in Minnesota, we've been able to see so much proactive change across the board, across issues. And it's inspiring to see leadership that is really active in working towards the needs and wants and goals of Minnesota families. in a really active way. And so it's exciting to see Governor Tim Walz now on the presidential ticket and know that a leader who has really, really worked hard to represent the needs of Minnesotans and to create change in an ongoing way in our communities, now be given the stage and the opportunity to bring those policies into a bigger platform. Things like codifying abortion rights, protecting reproductive health care, protecting trans health care, and LGBTQ Americans, climate change, all of the things that we're talking about. These are really popular policies and policies that deserve to be celebrated. And we're looking forward to seeing Governor Tim Walz, represent Minnesota, represent this progressiveness on a bigger stage, and with Kamala Harris, of course.
Yeah, well, that seems like a perfect place to end. So Emma Poyer, Alliance for a Better Minnesota, thanks so much for joining Out in Front.
Yeah, thank you so much for having me.